was fantastic. Let's give all of our award winners one more round of applause. I'm excited to introduce our keynote speaker today. Dr. Jesse Stommel is a faculty member in the writing program at the University of Denver. He is co-founder of Digital Pedagogy Lab and Hybrid Pedagogy, the Journal of Critical Digital Pedagogy, and he earned his PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder. Stommel is co-author of An Urgency of Teachers, the work of Critical Digital Pedagogy, co-editor of Disrupting the Digital Humanities, and co-editor of Critical Digital Pedagogy, a collection. He is best known for his work as a champion of teachers and students in higher education. He is executive director of Hybrid Pedagogy, the Journal of Critical Digital Pedagogy. I already said that. I'll skip that redundancy there. He experiments relentlessly with learning interfaces, both digital and analog, and his research focuses on higher education pedagogy, critical digital pedagogy, and assessment. Stommel was most previously a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This looks like an old line. And he has a rascal pup, Emily, a clever cat, Loki, and a badass daughter, Hazel. Dr. Jesse Stommel.
I really just wanted to see how many times I could make him say the word pedagogy. I always think I need to make a little bit of a revision because by about the 12th time they say it. But in some ways I do that on purpose because I want to normalize us talking about pedagogy. It feels like it's been so infrequent in my career that I find myself in rooms like this. I want to find myself in rooms like this every week because I feel like at the heart of the work that I do is talking to other teachers about this work that we do. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about assessment and talk a little bit about the concept of ungrading. I'm going to just start with the thesis of my presentation today, and that is the bit that I have on the screen behind me. Ungrading means raising an eyebrow at grades as a systemic practice, distinct from simply not grading. The word is a present participle, an ongoing process, not a static set of practices. So while I will have a good amount of practical information for you all, what my presentation is focused more on is the sort of whys, less than the hows of ungrading. Why do we do this work? Why is it important to rethink our approaches to assessment? I'm going to leave a good amount of time for discussion and question and answer at the end because in some ways I want the practical conversation to rise out of the stuff that's happening for you all. This is where you can contact me if you want to continue the conversation. I really hate the idea. I'm a closet introvert. I hate the idea, which is weird that I find myself on stages like this in front of huge groups of people. Secretly an introvert. Most people can't guess it because I've taught myself over 25 years of teaching how to be in front of large rooms of people. But for me as an introvert, one thing that's really important is that the conversation not stop here. So anybody that wants to reach out to me, I am on social media. Social media is a little bit of a strange place. I used to be on Twitter pretty frequently. That's where I met Travis, in fact. And I'm not quite there that often anymore. I have kind of moved a little bit to Blue Sky, but I'm still trying to figure out what the social media ecosystem is these days. But most social media, you can find me at Jessifer. Feel free to reach out to me there. But you can also connect with me on email. Even if you just want to tell me what's up in your classroom, even if you don't have a question, you just want to share a success that you had, or share something that you found useful in my talk today. Or if you have a question, if you find that there's some practical thing that you're struggling with, feel free to reach out to me. This is a picture of my daughter, Hazel. In some ways, I start with this because I feel like the work of teaching is deeply human, the work of connecting with students, and also the work of connecting with you all. So bringing a little bit of who I am to this presentation is what I'm doing here with this picture of my daughter. She's actually 8 years old. now. This is a picture of her when she was very tiny. She's got her little, I love that in this picture she's got her little resist fist there, and she's got a t-shirt, if you can't read it, it says, "Well-behaved women rarely make history." And she still is this kid. It's wild that at 4 months, I think she's about 4 months in this picture, she was born with a lot of hair. At 4 months, she had the spunk that she still has today. She's 8, she's running, wreaking havoc around the entire world. She's become a fashionista, she's doing her own makeup. She loves to do full black eyeshadow. She's in love with Wednesday. She keeps me on my toes. And part of this is that I bring her with me to all of the presentations I give and everything that I do as a teacher. I think that we have to acknowledge who we are and what we bring into the classroom and how that affects the interactions that we have. This is where you can find some notes from my presentation today. There's also some workshop notes here with activities that you can do. Feel free to steal anything that you find here. There's also a bibliography. I have several bibliographies out in the world. The bibliography that's at this notes page is focused on very short readings. Most of the readings in this bibliography take 20 minutes or less to read. I also gear this towards readings that you can do together with your students. One of the things that I find is if there's nothing else you change about how you do assessment, start by just talking to your students about grades. What are grades? How do grades make you feel? Simple questions just to get conversations going. Usually I find that when I start a conversation like that, I think, oh, I'm gonna have a little 5-10 minute conversation about grades with students. It ends up being a 40-minute conversation because as much baggage as we bring to the work of grading and the work of assessment, our students also bring that kind of baggage. And just unpacking some of that, having that one conversation helps you kind of let students under the hood of grades and assessment, and also lets you kind of be inside of their head about how these things work for them. So feel free to use any of the resources that you find there. The other thing that you'll find there is several versions of the slides you're about to see. One of them is a OCR-enabled PDF, and then there also is an embedded version of this slideshow. And again, feel free to share that with your students, share it with anyone that you find will find it useful. I often say that there's no plagiarism in pedagogy. And sure, there probably is some plagiarism in pedagogy. If you take a paragraph from my book and put it in your book without an attribution, yeah, that's plagiarism. But what I mean when I say there's no plagiarism in pedagogy is that I think that we do this work together. And I think that we need to support each other. And so anything that you find here, anything you find on my syllabi, feel free to use in any way that ends up being useful to you. So I'm going to start with some foundational questions about assessment. These are the questions that I use when I'm running longer workshops about grades, ungrading, and assessment. These are sort of the foundation, the sort of thinking through the whys of assessment, the why that we're here at this conversation, the why that we struggle so much when we're thinking about grades, the why of why this becomes such a difficult part of our job. I remember when I first started teaching 25 years ago, I dreaded that moment at the end of the semester where I would have a stack of 100 or sometimes hundreds of papers from students that I had to go through, and it felt like grading was a weight that was on my shoulders. And really, I don't think it was as much of a weight of time, it was more of an emotional weight, almost an existential weight, because it felt like so much of the baggage I brought, so much of the baggage my students brought, and so much of the bureaucracies of our institution are bound up in this moment of grading. So starting with big questions as a way to kind of unpack that baggage. Who is assessment for? How does this question ask us to rethink how institutions structure their systems for evaluation? There's lots of answers to this question. Assessment is for the institution itself, it's for us, it's for accreditors, it's for future employers, we could go on. It's for the way that we structure our programs, it's for program development, program evaluation. Ultimately, I think the most important audience for assessment should be the students themselves. And so when we're thinking about all of those audiences and recognizing that we have to keep all of those audiences in mind when we're doing the work of assessment, starting from a place of first and foremost, this work is for students, and it's for bettering the relationship that we have with students as opposed to creating some kind of blockade in that relationship. Number two, what's the difference between grading and feedback? Can we imagine assessment mechanisms designed less for quantifying learning and more for learning through assessment? Ultimately, when we think about doing the work of grading and we think about doing less grading, which is what I'm going to be talking about, people often think, oh gosh, if you're not giving grades, you must have to spend a ton of time giving feedback. I think it's important to unpack that a little bit and think about what kind of feedback we're giving and when we're giving that feedback. Ultimately, when I'm giving feedback to students, my brother is a social worker. He lives in Grand Junction. I grew up in Rifle, Colorado, right on the Colorado-Utah border. I grew up going to Moab and going through Utah quite a lot. And so as a social worker, he has this concept that he talks about, which he says, never coach into no requests. And what he means by that is don't give people feedback if they haven't asked for it. And so ultimately, when I'm working with students, I'm constantly having them do self-reflection and self-evaluation and asking them to ask me for feedback on specific aspects of their work. So it doesn't mean I'm just throwing feedback at them. So there's a way that we can think about grades as being hierarchical, but we can also think about giving feedback as hierarchical. So think about ways that you can get information from students so you can find out the specific feedback that you can tailor to them, rather than doing what I did at the beginning of my career, which is when I wasn't giving grades. I've actually never put a grade on a piece of student work in my entire career. But at the beginning, I felt like because I wasn't giving grades, I had to write paragraphs and paragraphs of feedback. And so I would spend 20, 30, 40 hours writing feedback on every student paper. And what I realized over many years is there's a lot of research that shows that when students just get unsolicited feedback like that, they often don't read it. So instead, what I find is asking students to tell me what they need feedback on, and then I can tailor my feedback to the specific students. I've also found over many years that most students want feedback on the same sorts of things. And so what I've begun doing is writing letters to an entire class and then giving tailored feedback to specific students where it's necessary. So I'm not necessarily going to argue for us replacing grades with feedback. Instead, I want to push on both things and push on the way that we do both things. Because ultimately, when I started teaching, I was a road warrior adjunct teaching 9 classes at 4 different institutions, over 1,000 students per year in some cases. I didn't necessarily have time to give individual letters to every student that I was working at. And I really want to acknowledge that all of us are working precariously to some degree. We heard a little mention about the precarity of just higher education as a whole, but also many of us in this room are probably working in precarious positions as adjuncts or as sessional or as contract staff members. 3, why do we grade? I think this is the most important question. How does it feel to be graded? What do we want grading to do or not do in our classes for students or teachers? So getting at that question of why do we grade, and then asking bigger questions like, what do we think the purpose of education is? What do we want students to get out of our classes? What kinds of relationships do we want to develop with students? And then making sure that our reasons for why we grade are in line with all of our answers to all of those other questions. And number 4, what would happen if we didn't grade? What would be the benefits? What issues would this raise for students and or teachers? What kind of structural obstacles would we face? Deciding to ungrade has to come from somewhere, has to do more than ring a bell. It has to have pedagogical purpose and to be part of a larger picture of how and why we teach. This is from a colleague of mine, Sean Michael Morris, who wrote a piece, "When we talk about grades, we are talking about people." And in his work on grades and ungrading, he pushes on the nature of grades and the hierarchical nature of grades and the way that grades structure power relationships between students and teachers. And so if we're thinking about changing the way that we do assessment, one of the things I think we're thinking about is changing how power works in our classroom. And that's a really complicated thing to unpack. So in some ways, I think the harder work of ungrading is getting our brains around how we start to dismantle some of those power structures in our classrooms. So If ungrading comes from a deeper place in our pedagogy, I want to just talk briefly about how I came to the work of ungrading. When I first started teaching, the work that I was reading was work by Paulo Freire and Bell Hooks, works of critical pedagogy. And so as I was starting out as a teacher, I was thinking about, well, how do grades align with the stuff that I was reading in critical pedagogy? I actually wrote a piece very early on called If Paulo Freire Made a MOOC. You may remember the year of the MOOC, the massive open online courses that were going to completely revolutionize education. I don't think they did revolution education, but they did create some really interesting conversations. Of course, Paulo Freire wouldn't make a MOOC. I later wrote a piece called If Bell Hooks Made a Learning Management System. And ultimately, it was a thought experiment, thinking about how do these things sit alongside one another. And so I looked at my own approach to assessment and set it alongside some of the work of Paulo Freire and Bell Hooks and realized that there was a fundamental disjuncture between those. And thinking about how I could transform my assessment so it aligned with my deeper pedagogical values. For me, pedagogy is praxis, insistently perched at the intersection between the philosophy and the practice of teaching. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire argues against the banking model of education, an act of depositing in which the students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. In place of the banking model, Freire advocates for problem-posing education, in which a classroom or learning environment becomes a space for asking questions, a space of cognition, not information. He further talks about something he calls co-intentional education, and what he calls student-teacher and teacher-student, thinking really about the ways that we move in and out of those roles. So it isn't about dismantling the role of the teacher, but recognizing that we move in and out of the role of student and teacher, and that students are also moving in and out of that role. And helping dismantle the hierarchy allows them to take more ownership of their own education. This is Peter Elbow in a piece called Ranking, Evaluating, and Liking, and all of these pieces are linked from those notes that I gave you at the beginning. Assessment tends so much to drive and control teaching. Much of what we do in the classroom is determined by the assessment structures we work under. I found myself, I've been teaching 25 years, and I've been doing the work of faculty development for about 20 years. And I found so much of my time in events focused on teaching and learning were talking about grades. It's strange to me that over 25 years, I've never put a grade on a piece of student work, and yet here I find myself being a researcher in assessment. I didn't wake up one morning and said, yes, I want to spend all my time thinking about assessment. But what I found was that in all of these conversations, grades were the elephant in the room. I would be in conversations, really rich conversations about pedagogical approaches, new assignment design, and people would inevitably say, but how will we grade that? And what I recognized was that grades were the biggest structural opposition to the work that I was trying to do and the work that so many of my colleagues were trying to do. Taking a cue from one of my mentors, Marty Bickman, I've chosen never to grade, or at least almost never. While I still submit grades at the end of a term, I've foregone grades on individual assignments for over 20 years, relying on qualitative feedback, peer review, and self-reflection. There are many institutions across the country and around the world where they don't give grades, where they do feedback in place of grades. And there's a movement within even institutions that do traditional grading to, for example, remove grades from the freshman year or remove grades from certain classes within a cohort. I've actually never worked at one of those institutions. Every institution I've worked at requires me to give final grades. So I have given probably tens of thousands of final grades over the course of my career. So the question becomes, how do I arrive at those final grades? My goal in eschewing grades has been to more honestly engage student work rather than simply evaluate it. Taking grades at least partly off the table means I have a different set of conversations with students I work with. I'm working to create a safe space for students to ask critical questions about grades, about how school works, and about their own learning. This is a page from my syllabus. This is also linked to from those notes. This is at jessestommel.courses, which has almost all of my syllabi from over the years. And again, feel free to grab from those at will. Attribute, not attribute, however, whatever works best for you. The one thing I don't love is I don't love syllabi that are saying, well, here's my approach to grades, and by the way, this whole thing was stolen from Jesse Stommel. You don't necessarily have to do that. Feel free to mention me, but if you want to borrow these things and try them out, feel free to do so, and feel free to let me know how it works if you do. And also how it doesn't work. I think that's an interesting conversation as well, because teaching is deeply idiosyncratic. We each teach different students at different institutions in different disciplines, in different bodies, on different days. And so the work of teaching is idiosyncratic. There isn't something that I do that's going to be the magic secret sauce for your teaching. Instead, it's about taking whatever influences we can and find what works best for us and our students. So here in my section on grades and assessment, I write at the beginning, everyone who participates in our course community and completes their self-reflections will get an A. Instead of your grade, here's what I want you to focus on. And I talk to the students about what it means to participate in our course community, to complete their self-reflections. Ultimately, in my courses, I'm trying to focus on the labor that students are doing, how much they're engaged in the work of the course, how much they're engaged in the community. I don't give grades based on an evaluation of the specific work that they're doing, because ultimately what I recognize is my students are practicing at something. I'm not necessarily evaluating their end product. I want to focus on process, not product. And that is something that has to be tweaked and refined depending on what discipline that you're working in. Because if you're a nurse teaching someone to put in an IV line, product is actually pretty important. And so thinking about how we tweak things for our disciplines is crucial. I'm working right now with student writers, and I've worked with student filmmakers. And a lot of the stuff I'm teaching is deeply technical, but it's also something that I'm usually working with students at a very formative stage where they're just beginning to practice at something and where their work doesn't necessarily have real-world consequences. So even in a discipline like nursing, early on in the program, you could still use a process-based approach, as long as you're recognizing that at the end, they're still going to take a nursing licensure exam and that that's a real-world thing that they're going to have to encounter. So here I say, instead of focusing on your grade, here's what I want you to focus on. Actively engage in the work of the course. Writing is ultimately what this course is about, but there will be lots of different ways for each of us to engage. Determine what participation in our community looks like for you. So recognizing that each of our students are different and each will participate in the work of the course in different ways. And then the last thing, and this to me is the most important thing, reflect on your own work. This course is about process, not product, and so writing about our own writing is the most important work we'll do. Ultimately, the thing I think school is for is school is a place where we get to learn something, but also get to learn about our own learning. And I think teaching students to do self-assessment and self-evaluation, even if that's not at the center of your approach to assessment, is absolutely crucial. If you think about the amount of times we have to self-evaluate, people often ask, well, are you students good at self-evaluation? No. Am I good at self-evaluation? Not all the time. And it's something I'm still learning at 49 years old. So instead, it's something that we practice at, not necessarily something that my students become expert at or something that I feel I'm an expert at. And then the last thing I have here is in bold. It's one of the only pieces in bold in my entire syllabus. It says, you should consider this course a busy work free zone. If an assignment does not feel productive, we can find ways to modify, remix, or repurpose the instructions. That's the sense of giving students not just a look under the hood of the syllabus, under the hood of the course, but actually the tools that they need to make changes to the course itself. People often see this and they think, well, gosh, are you getting 75 requests from students to transform every assignment that you're doing for their specific needs? The truth is, no, I don't actually get that many requests. But what this line here is, it gives students permission to make small tweaks as they go. Small tweaks that I might not even notice. What it does is it tells students that the class isn't a bunch of bureaucratic exercises that they're meant to do. It's not a bunch of check boxes. So they might do the exact assignment that they would otherwise do without any modifications, but when they do that work, they don't necessarily feel like they're doing it because they're wondering what I'm expecting of them. I tell them right out of the gate, I'm expecting you to take ownership of the work in the class rather than ask me what my expectations are. This is just to give you a sense of how I situate the self-evaluations that I do. I usually have an entire week of the course focused on metacognition. You might be thinking in your head, wait, I can't give away an entire week of my course to the work of self-evaluation and self-reflection. What I do during that week is I situate the concept of metacognition within the discipline that I'm teaching. This was a course about digital, this was a digital studies course, an intro to digital studies course. So I had them reading about metacognition, but I also had them reading about ways of knowing, digital ways of knowing, ways of acknowledging and representing ourselves online. So connecting the self-reflection and self-evaluation that they're doing to ways of knowing within the discipline that we're working on. And then at the end of that week, they submit a self-reflection. And you can find this entire self-reflection linked from the notes and also from various writing that I've done. But ultimately, what I ask them to do is I ask them to write about their own learning. At the beginning of a term, I usually have them do this 2 to 3 times during a semester. Right now I'm teaching on a quarter system, so the term is only 10 weeks. In a 10-week class, I'm only having them do this twice. Often in a 15-week class, I might have them do it 3 times. And ultimately, it might begin with a series of very prescriptive questions. And then by the end of the term, it uses language like, write me a letter that talks about these kinds of things. So I kind of move them from answering questions to just writing and musing about their own learning. Again, in the course of 10 weeks, in the course of 15 weeks, do they completely understand and figure out how to do the work of metacognitive self-reflection? No, they don't, but they get practice at different approaches to that. So as you're working on the self-reflection, consider the statement on grading and assessment from our course syllabus. While you will get a final grade at the end of the term, I will not be grading individual assignments. You will be reflecting carefully on your own work and the work of your peers. If you are worried about your grade, your best strategy should be to join the discussions, do the reading, and complete the assignments. Again, I remind them you should consider this course a busy work-free zone. If an assignment does not feel productive, we can find ways to modify, remix, or repurpose the instructions. And I talk to students about the fact that even this work of self-reflection and metacognition is an assignment that they can modify. I've had a student ask me, hey, can I do a painting for my self-reflection? And I let them do a painting. My rule of thumb is to almost always say yes, because the people with the wackiest, weirdest ideas often do the most thoughtful and interesting work. So I have taught myself how to suspend judgment. I joked for many years that someone could do an interpretive dance. In my head, I didn't really think that an interpretive dance was probably the best way to sum up the work that we had done together all term. But finally, I had a student do an interpretive dance, and she got all of her roommates to do the interpretive dance with her. She choreographed it and had movements that reflected the various parts of the term, and then she brought her roommates to class and performed the interpretive dance for all of us. So now I don't joke anymore about the interpretive dance. I really mean, yeah, it probably could be an interpretive dance. The other thing I do with students is I have them read, as I mentioned earlier, I have them read about grades and have them read about how grades make meaning, how grades affect their learning, and a bit about why I don't do the work of grading. This is a really useful piece, Alfie Cohen's The Case Against Grades. If you have not read about ungrading or changing your approach to assessment, this is an amazing place to start. It's also a really, really wonderful piece to read together with students. Historically, grades are more of an anomaly than anything else. They are not a coincidence. And by they are not a coincidence, I mean that they have personal, emotional, political ramifications. Grades structure our institutions in so many different ways that we often aren't even aware of. And the second that you start to change your approach to assessment to a much more non-traditional approach, you immediately find all kinds of places where your approach isn't necessarily in sync with the institution. When people encounter that and when they feel like, wait, I don't know if my institution will allow me to do this. I don't know if my institution will make space for the approach that I'm using. What I often do is I ask people, where does your institution actually talk about the approach to assessment? What does it specifically say you have to do? What does it specifically say you can do and you can't do? So figure out what the actual rules of your institution are. Often we internalize more rules than are actually there. The other thing that I do is, again, it's like a thought experiment. Take the mission and vision statement of your institution and put it up next to your statement about assessment and grades in your syllabus. To what extent are these things in line? Often we find that our institution's approach to assessment and evaluation aren't actually really in line with the systems or the institution's own mission and vision statement. Prior to the late 1700s, performance and feedback systems in education were incredibly idiosyncratic. The first official record of a grading system was from Yale in 1785. Throughout the 19th century, they became increasingly comparative, numerical, and standardized. The A to F system appears to have emerged in 1898, with the E not disappearing until the 1930s, and the 100-point or percentage scale became common in the early 1900s. Letter grades were not widely used until the 1940s. Even by 1971, only 67% of primary and secondary schools in the US were using letter grades. Often when I ask the question, why do we grade? Some of the initial answers that I get back are some version of, well, that's how it's always been done. The truth is, grades are a relatively recent technology. So when we're pushing back on grades, reminding ourselves that 100 years ago, grades were not used in the way that they're used today. The other thing that's useful to know is there's not a lot of, which actually there is almost no research on the efficacy of grades and traditional approaches to evaluation. So grades, we have not been convinced in any thoughtful or rudimentary or academic way that grades work or grades are valuable. So there isn't much, when we're pushing back on grades, there's not really much to push back on, aside from the structures at our institutions that center grades and evaluation. An objective system for grading was created so systematized schooling could scale. And we've designed technological tools in the 20th and 21st centuries that have allowed us to scale further toward standardization and away from subjectivity, human relationships, and care. One of the reasons grades were invented was all of a sudden students were finding themselves in much larger schools. And those institutions had to decide where to put the students. So the shift from the one-room schoolhouse, and I'm really glossing over 100 years of history, but we have a shift from the one-room schoolhouse where all students were together in the same classroom, learning from each other simultaneously, to factory-style industrial schools where you suddenly had dozens upon dozens of classrooms. And they had to decide two things. They had to decide what classrooms to put people in, but they also had to decide where to seat them within those classrooms. And so they were seating people within classrooms based on their grades that they received. And in many institutions, they were actually seating the better performing students at the front of the class and the worst performing students at the back of the class, which is fascinating because there's research that shows where you sit in a classroom affects the grade that you get in the classroom. I'm going to tell you who in this room is going to get the best grade from me at the end. Probably you two. It might actually be you. It depends on where I'm standing. You're going to get a great grade, all of you. But actually, the person who's going to get the best grade is probably Travis. And I'll tell you why he's going to get the best grade. He's going to get the best grade because he's towards the front of the room and he's actually to my right. These people would get the best grade, but nobody sat in the gold star table. And that's because I'm right-handed. So ultimately, lots of studies showing that where you sit in the room determines the grade that you're going to get in the classroom. The people way back in there in the left, you're going to get the worst grades. I can barely see you. I definitely am not going to remember your faces. And it has a lot to do with how much we humanize the people that we're grading. I'm going to humanize him the most because I actually know him the best. So that's going to be something. So there's sort of a halo effect that's going to affect his grade. But even if I didn't know him, he'd be the one I was most likely to be looking at. He would be the face that I would be most likely to remember. Because he's towards the front and on my right side, because I'm right-handed. If you're left-handed, it's actually the students over on the left-hand side. If I were left-handed, you all would get the best grade. When the hows of assessment preoccupy us, they tend to chase the whys back into the shadows. Start by trusting students. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about the whys, why I do the work of ungrading. And this has been something that I've come to over many years. The beginning of my career, it was an instinct. I had actually only been ungraded a single time, or not traditionally graded, over the course of my entire education. Only one teacher used an alternative approach to assessment, and that was one of my mentors, Martin Bickman. And so when I was in his class, it sort of clicked for me, and it was almost instinctual. And so when I went to teach, I thought, Paulo Freire, bell hooks, this one class that I've taken. So I basically just borrowed his approach to assessment, and then over many years have kind of deepened it and figured out what my own whys are for doing this work. A Google search for "is cheating on the rise" finds a half dozen articles like one from the Washington Post, which cites data about the rise of online cheating reported by ProctorU, whose revenue model hinges upon a culture of suspicion in education. So for me, one of the whys is also to unpack the questions of, well, why not? Why might you not do this work? Well, students are cheating at a much higher rate, according to Google, and according to the Washington Post. Interestingly, Washington Post here is citing ProctorU, which is a remote proctoring system that watches students as they're taking an exam remotely and flags them for potential cheating. Usually what it's flagging is rapid eye movement, it's flagging someone looking off of the camera, it's flagging someone speaking while the test is going, it's also flagging someone needing to go up to the bathroom and forgetting to ask the remote proctor whether they can go to the bathroom. Maybe it's flagging someone who goes to the bathroom too many times during the exam. So you can sort of see some of the problems with a tool like this, that ultimately the students it's flagging are students who are more likely to be neurodivergent, more likely to not learn in traditional ways. So I find it fascinating that Washington Post cites ProctorU about the increase in cheating. So what's actually true? I think cheating feels like it's on the rise, and I kind of want to figure out whether it actually is. And so I do a little research into the history of cheating and the history of the amount of cheating that's happening. It turns out that cheating actually isn't on the rise. In 1963, Bowers surveyed roughly 100 institutions and found that 75% of the surveyed students admitted to cheating at least once in their college careers. The numbers have not changed much since then. McCabe et al.'s 2012 Cheating in College, Why Students Do It and What Educators Can Do About It includes findings from 150,000 students recently surveyed, showing that between 60 to 70% of respondents admitted cheating. So cheating is in fact over a 60-year period, 50-year period, is not on the rise, it's actually flat or even on a slight decline during that period. And when we look at data, you probably all saw in 2020 all kinds of horror stories, the same ones like these from the Washington Post, that, oh my gosh, the pandemic and online learning are increasing cheating at an absolutely amazing, astonishing rate. Truth is, same thing. When you dig into the research, you find that no, it actually wasn't increasing during that period. What was increasing during that period was the adoption of tools like ProctorU and tools like Turnitin, tools that catch cheaters. And those tools want to tell you that they've caught so many teachers, so they have a giant marketing machine behind them that convinces us that cheating is actually on the rise. We actually also feel like cheating is on the rise, in part because cheating feels like a personal attack to us. We put so much of ourself into the work of teaching. Wiley surveyed 789 instructors for their 2020 report on academic integrity in the age of online learning. 93% of those instructors felt students are more likely to cheat online than in person. What follows in the report is a guide to discouraging academic misconduct without any sources for an actual rise in cheating beyond the imagination of those surveyed. Interestingly, if I think about this data, the first thing I want to acknowledge that, I can understand why 93% feel like cheating is on the rise or students are more likely to cheat online. Goes back to the precarity that we talked about in higher education, the precarity of us as individual teachers, The increasing precarity, when 70% of teachers in higher education are working in sessional or term-based or adjunct contracts, our work feels precarious. And a lot of us are working an extreme amount, and we put so much of ourselves into teaching. So I don't want to sort of demean the emotion. These emotions are real. It does feel like this is happening, but if we actually look at the data, the truth is it's not happening. So then I want to unpack like what's actually going on here. The remote proctoring industry is expected to grow from being a $4 billion market in 2019 to a nearly $21 billion market in 2023. The truth is it's actually turned out to be a little less than that because there was a lot of pushback on those remote proctoring tools, but it is still a multi-billion dollar market with a giant marketing machine behind it. They profit off of convincing us that cheating is on the rise. And when you look at a tool like Turnitin is doing something similar. According to Business Wire, the global learning management system market is expected to grow from 13 billion in 2021 to 31 billion by 2027. What pedagogies are at the foundation of these systems? How does the structure of these systems influence the relationships between teachers and students? Many of these systems have an architecture structured around a grade book, reducing students to rows in a spreadsheet and their work to columns. How does centering grades and instrumentalizing student work change the nature of work and education? When we think about this, this feeling that students are more likely to cheat online, and we take it back to that research about what grades people are going to get in this room, Travis seems incredibly human to me. I've had conversations with him personally. I've made lots of eye contact with him in this presentation. The people back there in that corner don't feel like human beings to me. I'm not sure that I could even pick them out from a crowd. If I saw their name on a grade book, I wouldn't remember who they are. I wouldn't remember anything about them. So the more we dehumanize students and dehumanize the relationships we have with students through things like online learning, although certainly online learning can be done well where it doesn't do that, but through the use of online learning management systems that reduce students to rows in a grade book. Just a stack of names where none of those people are distinguishable from any of the others. I do like certain tools where it focuses you on, interestingly, Canvas has a tool. What learning management system do you all use? Canvas. It has a tool called SpeedGrader, which I think is the worst name for a tool ever, because in fact, what SpeedGrader does is it lets you look at each student individually and then click through them, but at least they aren't rows in a spreadsheet. They actually are, each of their individual work comes up in front of you. So I think it sort of almost does the exact opposite of speed grading. It forces you to grapple with the individual student rather than just reducing them to a dehumanized name in a list of, in a grade book. However we might try to reinvent them, grades are flawed. Grades reflect bias, grades do disproportionate harm to marginalized students and teachers, grades don't communicate coherently, grades don't adequately measure what we value most about learning, grades contribute to a culture of competition in education, and over-reliance on extrinsic motivation short-circuits intrinsic motivation. This is a meta-analysis of bias in grading. This meta-analysis includes data from 20 studies of 1,935 graders. The authors ultimately suggest blind grading. The results suggest that bias can occur in subjective grading when graders are aware of irrelevant information about the students. And specifically, this is highlighted down at the in the red. It says the results are down at the very bottom. The focus of the bias could be prior experience with student, e.g. a halo effect, some physical characteristic, such as sex, race, or physical attractiveness, or some assigned status, such as being classified as gifted or learning disabled. So the idea is that if we know these things about students, bias is going to be reflected in the grading. I love this study, especially because the amount of studies it includes and the amount of graders that it includes, and ultimately that it shows that bias exists. The thing I don't love about the study is that it argues for blind grading. Blind grading means that you try and grade your students without knowing anything about them. You maybe grade them based on their social security number. They do work. You don't know which student you're actually grading. The reason I don't love blind grading, and I'm not completely opposed to it if that's the approach that people use, the reason I don't love it personally is I find that when I'm grading writing, it's impossible for me not to know things about students. And I think in most cases, if we're doing really robust, complex assessments, we'll be able to know things about our students. And so then the bias can continue to occur. For example, a dyslexic student, that will come out in their writing. And so the bias will still be reflected. I think instead of something like blind grading, just the opposite. Find out as much as possible about your students so that you can grade them, and as you're grading them, you're thinking about all of the complexity of their identity and how it might affect and impact their work. I also hate the fact that they say that this is irrelevant information about the students, because things like sex, race, physical attractiveness, that might be irrelevant. Assigned status, being classified as gifted or learning disabled, prior experience with the student, those don't seem like irrelevant things to me. They seem deeply, deeply relevant. These are, this data here is from K through 12 education, but a lot of these studies have been duplicated with college students. It's from a piece by Soraya Shimali called All Teachers Should Be Trained to Overcome Their Hidden Biases. This was in Time magazine. It's on my notes, but you can also just Google this title and you'll find it. The thing I love about this article is very short, but she links to every study. And so I've gone in and drilled down and actually read all of the studies that she cites in this article, and there's a wealth of stuff there. I'm just going to highlight a few of the studies, even though she highlights dozens of different studies in the piece. Black girls are 12 times more likely than their white counterparts to be suspended. While black children make up less than 20% of preschoolers, they make up more than half of out-of-school suspensions. I have to let that sink in. My daughter is black. She was in preschool when I first started looking at this data. She's now just entered 3rd grade. Yesterday was her first day of school. She got a fever. I just found out she got a fever, so she had to miss her 2nd day of school, and I thought that was such a bummer. So she's not in school today. She's at home. But when I first saw this data, I was thinking about her, and I remember feeling absolutely shocked at this. Black children make up less than 20% of preschoolers. They make up more than half of out-of-school suspensions. When I read that, I thought, wait, out-of-school suspensions for preschoolers? It did not make sense to me. It did not jive for me. But ultimately, I need to acknowledge my own privilege there. The reason that doesn't make sense for me, because it doesn't line up at all with my own educational experience. The reason I'm shocked that black children are being suspended from preschoolers is because that wasn't even something that was possible for me to fathom. Teachers spend up to 2/3 of their time talking to male students. They also are more likely to interrupt girls. When teachers ask questions, they direct their gaze towards boys more often, especially when questions are open-ended. This has been duplicated with college students as well, and interestingly, the data shows that it is both male and female teachers who are more likely to look at male students, more likely to ask open-ended questions of male students, and more likely to interrupt girl students. Again, if you imagine this black girl who might have been suspended when she was in preschool, her teachers, both male and female, are not making eye contact with her, are interrupting her repeatedly. And you imagine that she's the freshman who comes into our college class. And we imagine what her educational experience will be in that classroom. That is, for me, the reason why this isn't irrelevant information. In fact, it's the most important information. To not only know what our students are experiencing right now, but to understand what their educational experience has been. That's why that simple, why do we grade? How does it feel to be graded? That simple conversation can often bring up conversation about what our students' educational experiences have been up to the point that they arrived in our classrooms. Food insecurity is a significant factor in determining the average math SAT score. An increase in food insecurity lowers the students' math SAT scores. So when we're giving a math test and students are not performing well, one of the reasons they might not be performing well is because they're experiencing food insecurity. So thinking about when we, not only what kinds of exams we're giving, but also when we're giving that exam and how that might impact students who are currently experiencing food insecurity. There's data out there that shows that 1 in 2 students at our institutions have experienced food insecurity in the last 30 days. So that means half of the students. And this has been duplicated at institutions all across the country, irregardless of size, location, whether it's public or private, whether it's a community college or an R1. Almost all of the institutions are showing data that 1 in 2 students are experiencing food insecurity in the last 30 days. During the pandemic, it was closer to 2/3 of students experiencing food insecurity. Cotty et al. Found that students perform more poorly on exams when they are several weeks removed from receiving food stamp benefits. So it isn't just whether our students have or are experiencing food insecurity, but it's how recently they have gotten support or support for that food insecurity. So I often think about this as a policy problem, thinking about how our institution can address the food insecurity problem that our students are facing, and housing insecurity as well. But for me, this data shows that this is also a pedagogical problem. So thinking about our students, thinking about knowing whether our students had breakfast that morning becomes absolutely crucial when we're working with these students. My close colleague, Sarah Goldrick-Rabb, who I've written some pieces with and done quite a bit of work with, focuses on food and housing insecurity among college students. And she often tells a story about a student who is asleep in her class. Rather than calling that student out or penalizing that student in some way, she went and she just talked to that student and said, "Hey, what's going on? I noticed you sleeping today." Found out from the student that the student was food insecure, housing insecure, found out information about that student that helped her understand what was happening. He wasn't sleeping because he played video games the previous night. He wasn't sleeping because he had been at a frat party. Certainly, we imagine that those might be reasons someone might be falling asleep in class. But the truth is, what she found out was that something much more difficult was going on for that student, something much more challenging. Got information that helped her work with that student, but also changed the nature of her research. Children displayed a statistically significant increase in cortisol level in anticipation of high-stakes testing. Large decreases and large increases in cortisol were associated with underperformance on the high-stakes test. And this isn't just about testing, but also any kind of high-stakes assessment. So even if it's a paper, if your class only has 3 assessments over the course of the term, each of those 3 assessments is going to be high stakes or feel high stakes for the student, no matter the nature of them. So there's a way in which thinking about how often we assess, and also too much assessment can also make it feel high stakes. It feels like they're never escaping assessment. And so being really thoughtful about where we place assessment and what the stakes of that assessment might be. So here, this is pointing out that 2 things are happening. One, an increase in cortisol levels. So an increase in cortisol levels would be associated with acute anxiety. It might be associated with some traumatic event that the student had experienced that day, that affects their performance on the exam. But it's also pointing out that large decreases in cortisol affect the performance on high-stakes assessments. Decreases would be associated with things like chronic trauma, dissociation. I have PTSD. I have chronic PTSD. I've had it most of my life. I'm impacted by this, not necessarily by that acute anxiety, but by that dissociation and that chronic trauma. During the pandemic, we saw a huge amount of both of these things, but I found that with my students, those things haven't significantly decreased since the pandemic, in part because our students now experienced a traumatic event in 2020 at a really key, crucial point in their development. I think now we're at the group of students who were freshmen and experiencing their freshman year of high school around that time during the pandemic. So a sort of really important moment in their education got absolutely and utterly transformed suddenly for them, and that continues to affect them. This is showing, it's not quite, I'm just going to explain what we're seeing here. It's showing changes in cortisol during low stakes and high stakes testing. But it's also then correlating this with poverty level. And so what we're seeing on the left, this is low stakes testing. So with low stakes testing, you can see that the below median poverty and the above median poverty follow about the same line. They experience about the same amount of change in cortisol. But what you're seeing over on the right is that a shift happens. The below median poverty level students experience a higher rate, a higher change in cortisol level. So you can see that the peak happens a little bit later, and that means that there's more incidence of higher levels of cortisol above the baseline in that group. So ultimately, when we're thinking about something like cortisol, also recognizing that something like poverty level affects cortisol as well. So our students who are experiencing food insecurity, housing insecurity, are also then more likely to experience drastic changes in cortisol. First-generation students performed more poorly compared to continuing generation students only when the function of selection was salient, while no difference appeared in the no selection condition. The function of selection in this study was a reminder of the competitive nature of college and that some students are more deserving than others. And you think about what kinds of things signal this to students. So again, a first-generation student, if they're reminded that college is difficult and hard and that some of you will succeed and some of you won't succeed, this is language that we see in a lot of our disciplines. Some of you will make it through this course. Some of you will really struggle. The second that you say that, a first-generation student is more likely to be negatively affected by that kind of language. And even the positive language like some of you are really going to excel. The second you put that some of you at the beginning, it becomes a reminder. It becomes the function of selection here. It becomes a reminder that college is competitive and only some people are going to succeed. And that negatively impacts the first-generation students more than it does the rest of the students. There is consensus in the literature about the benefits of a student's sense of belonging. Researchers suggest that higher levels of belonging lead to increases in GPA, academic achievement, and motivation. So how in our classes are we creating relationships between us and the students, but also between the students and each other? How are we creating relationships where people feel that sense of belonging? I remember when I first started teaching, and not to demean anyone who uses this language, because I understand where it comes from, and I understand that creating boundaries is an incredibly important thing as a teacher. Ultimately, when I'm thinking about building trust, there are multiple things that we do when we build trust. We're vulnerable with people, vulnerable with our students, vulnerable with an audience, but also we set good boundaries for ourselves. So both of those things are absolutely important and crucial when creating relationships and trust. But I remember when I first started teaching, hearing a lot of people say, my students aren't my friend. And I thought to myself, what does that actually mean? Like, what's underneath that? And why does that kind of make me itch so much? And I think the reason it makes me itch is data like this that shows that students, that sense of belonging is so key to student success. And that doesn't have to be calling all of our students our friends, but instead it's thinking about how do we create genuine relationships with them? Genuine relationships where there's vulnerability and boundaries. And also recognizing that that relationship is deeply pedagogical. We want our students to succeed. Students succeed better when they feel a sense of belonging, when they feel a sense of connection. Going back to the data about cheating, there are multiple studies that show that students are less likely to cheat if they believe that their teacher cares about them and cares about their work. And so, if we want students to cheat less, there are potentially there's probably many, many things that we can do, but let's say that there's two things that we're gonna choose between. We're either gonna use Turnitin and ask every single one of our students to submit their work to Turnitin, or we're gonna make a genuine connection with our students and let them know that their work matters to us and that they matter to us. The research all shows that this is actually more effective at decreasing cheating than policing them and their work, which actually increases a culture of suspicion and a sense of distrust. So when we're using this, isn't necessarily to say your institution may require you to use Turnitin in specific ways. It isn't necessarily to say that we should never use a tool like Turnitin, although I don't personally use it, but it's to say that this is actually more effective at the thing that we're trying to do. Let's skip that one. This is a piece from the piece that I wrote with Sarah Goldrick-Rab, which was in the Chronicle of Higher Education, teaching the students we have, not the students we wish we had. We need to design our pedagogical approaches for the students we have, not the students we wish we had. This requires approaches that are responsive, inclusive, adaptive, challenging, and compassionate. This is not a theoretical exercise, it's a practical one. So I'm going to end with a few practical bits about how you can approach the work of ungrading and changing how you do assessment in your classroom. And then I'm going to try and very quickly open it up to discussion and question and answer so that we can get to some of the practical hows and whys that you're dealing with in your classes. These are some possible approaches to alternative assessment, minimal grading. This is from Peter Elbrow, using scales with fewer gradation to make grading simpler, fairer, clearer. He talks about our grading systems and how we use. I remember when I first started teaching online, the community college that I was at used a 1,000-point grading system. So students were collecting up to 1,000 points over the course of the term, and if they got 900 to 1,000, they got an A. There were 1,000 gradations over the course of the term. We often use things like the 100-point scale, or we might use the traditional letter grade, and I think in letter grades there's 14 gradations. He argues that the more gradations you have, the less clarity there is. So if what we're wanting to do is communicate to students clearly about how they're doing in a class, less gradations are better. So if you look at a 100-point scale, and I give you a 98, and I give you a 99, what are the differences between those two grades? The only real functional difference is that your grade is higher than yours. It doesn't really communicate anything else clearer than that. So the more gradations we have, the more it increases a sense of competition and comparing grades to one another. Fewer gradations, and he argues for 3-point, 2-point, 1-point scales. 3-point scale might be needs improvement, acceptable, excellent. And he actually argues for using actual words, not using like check minus, check plus. Using actual words so that you're communicating to students using language, not arbitrary symbols. A 2-point scale might be accepted, needs revision. A 1-point scale is an assignment where just doing the assignment is done. You turn in the assignment, you get the points, or you get the credit for it. And ultimately thinking about which of our assignments warrant different kinds of approaches. Often we say, well, let's use the 100-point scale for every assignment. But some of our assignments, that doesn't really make sense to use a 100-point scale. So thinking about each assignment and thinking about how we structure that assignment's assessment. He also argues, and this is my favorite thing from this piece, for what he calls the 0-point scale. And I've learned a lot from this 0-point scale. And a 0-point scale is asking students to do work and then not even collecting it. It doesn't mean asking them to journal and then looking and seeing whether they journal. That would still be 1-point scale. It's literally asking students to do work and then not even paying any mind or attention to whether they did the work. And this requires a lot of kind of letting go, because immediately you wonder, well, then why are they going to do it? Maybe they won't do it. Are they doing it? You have to kind of say, suspend disbelief, ask students to do work, and then let them decide whether they're going to do it or not. The cool thing about the 0-point scale is people often think, well, your class is easy because your students just know they're going to get an A. My favorite comment that I ever got from a student was, this class was the hardest class I took in my life. It was an easy A. And they said both of those things. And it was partly because something like the 0-point scale has allowed me to ask a lot more of students. And when we build trust with students and when they're not afraid of what grade they're going to get or afraid of doing what's acceptable to us, we can actually challenge them and push them even harder in some cases. Contract grading. Grading contracts convey expectations about what's required for each grade. Students do work toward the grade they want to achieve, and goalposts don't unexpectedly shift. So a grading contract is, for an A, you will do these 3 things. For a B, you must do these 2 things. For a C, you must do this 1 thing. If you do nothing, you get an F. And I've seen that done really elaborately through full pages that describe the contract that students are sort of signing up to. But when they use the language of contract, ultimately what they mean is that the student can make a decision from the beginning of a term what grade they want and then know exactly what they have to do in order to get that grade. Someone, Asao B. Inui, writes about what he calls labor-based contract grading, which means that the contract is not based on the quality of the work, it's based on how much work the students do. If you do this much work, you will get this grade. If you do this much work, you will get this grade. Authentic assessment, having students do work for real-world audiences, focusing on intrinsic motivation, and drawing students into the design of assignments, assessments. So having students put on a colloquia series where you're ultimately not grading. They're being graded authentically by the reactions that the audience or the attendees have to the event that they're creating. And the last one here is the one I've described that I've used for most of my careers. At different times, I've called these self-reflections, self-evaluations. I've also called them process letters, asking students to reflect on their work and offer feedback on those reflections. Students help guide the grading of their own work. Ultimately, I ask students to give themselves a grade and talk about the work that they've done, and 95% of the time, probably 98% of the time, I give them the grade that they give themselves. I'm going to end with some what I call, I don't love best practices. I don't love best practices because, again, each of us is idiosyncratic, teaching different students in different disciplines at different institutions and teaching in different bodies. But these are what I call good for some people in some contexts practices. 1, change how you talk about assessment. Ungrading works best as part of a holistic pedagogical practice. Use words like ask or invite rather than submit or required. Ask students about their expectations for their work rather than centering yours. So think about the language that you're using when you're talking about assessment. And oftentimes it's really subtle things we do. Think about using, I remember I looked at my syllabus and I just did a find all for the term submit. And it was probably used 8 to 10 times throughout the course of my syllabus. And I asked myself, is submit really the thing I want them to be doing? How does that feed into that kind of banking model of education, where they submit a bunch of things to me and then I mark it with a grade? Instead, thinking about different language that conveys what I actually want students to be doing. And so now I use the word share. And I have students, instead of submitting the work to me, they share it with the entire class. I have 90% of the assignments that my students do, they share with the entire class rather than just having me as a singular audience. 2, invite students to a conversation about grades. Ask students how being graded makes them feel, how it affects their motivation. As a group, read and discuss a piece like Alfie Cohen's The Case Against Grades. 3, grade less stuff, grade less often, grade more simply. So even if you change almost nothing, just asking yourself, I have 10 assignments. Do I really have to grade all 10 of those? Are there 5 that are the most important for me to grade, and the other 5 can be 0-point scale assignments? It also frees us up. Remember when I first started teaching, I felt like everything my students submitted, I had to actually read. And what I learned over the years was that I want my students to do more work than I can possibly read and engage with all of it. So now what I have students do when they submit their self-reflection, they tell me what of their work they want me to read and offer feedback on. So they do a self-reflection, and then they share links to the specific things they want me to take a more careful look at. 4, ask students to reflect on their own learning. Even if you change nothing else about how you grade, ask students when and how they learn, ask what barriers they face, listen, and believe the answers. And I'm going to end there and open up to discussion. Thank you all.